All right, welcome back, everybody. This is officially part three of a three YouTube lecture series as part of your module for the past 2 weeks with filmmaking, or this, I guess, over this 2 week period. This is also the second part of film history. And so definitely encourage you to watch this because some of this will definitely be on a quiz or final exam. All right, so I know that we've already covered in part one and part two, both the financial impact, cultural impact of film. We've also talked about the first part of history in terms of, how we went from basically doing simple motion to developing narrative. Now what I want to do is kind of take a look at sort of some of the highlights of each of the decades, to modern day. Now I know we're not going to do all of them, but we're going to do what I think are the most significant. So we'll pick this up in the 1920s. And again, remember the business model that was put forth by folks who moved west to Hollywood, basically during the World War I era, breaking away from Thomas Edison's group, really created kind of an absolute financial boom for not just the industry, but for Hollywood, but for actors and anyone involved with the industry. So between 1914 and 1924, the cost of a feature film increased 1,500%. By the way, by 1918, American film dominated 80% of the worldwide market. So really, it became Hollywood and American film became kind of the, center of the entertainment universe, if you will. Huge salaries, though, led to wealth and questionable decisions, which led to the film industry being cleaned up. For example, drugs, prostitution, bootleg whiskey were all part of the Hollywood culture. In 1922, Fatty Arbuckle was involved in a rape case. Two other female stars implicated in the murder of a prominent director. And so there was this push, because that was bad for business, right? There was this push by the American public to have the government kind of step in and help clean up the industry, which it kind of did, right? So the public rebelled, the government set up standards for the film industry. Films were cleaned up and had to be cleaned up, in quotes, had to be wholesome. So there was a lot of pretty risque films that believe it or not, were a part of the industry 100 years ago, much more than I think you would imagine. But anyway, another significant moment in the 20s had to do with Warner Brothers. And Warner Brothers was on the outside looking in. The company didn't own movie theaters in big cities, therefore could not present its pictures in the biggest markets. So it tried something different, which wound up being an absolute game changer. In 1927, Warner Brothers released The Jazz Singer, in which Al Jolson, who was a vaudeville mainstay, sang on screen, and you could actually hear it and see it. So I encourage you to click on that link. And if that for some reason doesn't work, then just type in Jazz Singer or Mammy, Mammy, Al Jolson, and you should be able to see that scene. Now, I'm not going to play it only because I think that if I do, I'm almost guaranteed to get it knocked from YouTube. So make sure that you watch it. Now, what is significant about it? Well, obviously you can see and hear it. He sings. It starts the sound era of film. It's no longer silent. And I think another thing you will notice is that he does it in blackface. It's a minstrel show. And so obviously, much like Birth of a Nation, which, you can definitely say had some racial undertones to it for sure. You could say the same thing about Jazz Singer. But bottom line is, it basically killed off silent film. It took 2 years, but silent film was all but dead, and it had everything to do with Warner Brothers and The Jazz Singer. So talkies insulated Hollywood, by the way. Talkies, by the way, is what this term became. Insulated Hollywood from the start of the Depression. And by 1929, the average weekly movie attendance was 80 million. So imagine this. The world falls apart financially. Hollywood goes the other direction. If you remember, we talked about in television how popular Netflix became and Netflix viewing became during the first part of the pandemic because we had nowhere else to go but inside and watch. Well, think about it from a depression standpoint. 25% of the public out of stock market crashes. Soon we have 25% unemployment. 1 out of every 4 American adults is out of work. And so how do you get through that, kind of mental struggle, you escape, and you escape by watching storytelling on screen, right? Anyway, that led to the 1930s, which is considered the golden age of Hollywood, right? At this point, you had average movie attendance is 80 million by 1930, or I'm sorry, it reached 90 million by the 1930s. The average cost of an adult admission was less than 50 cents. Children were half price. On average, between 2 and 3 tickets to the movies were sold each week to every household in America. And you also had 400 films being produced during a year during the 1930s. And between 1930 and 1950, studios dominated the landscape. We'll show you how they wind up losing power, but certainly in the 1930s, if you had to be part of the studio system, and it was epic, right? 1934, MGM had over 60 big name actors and focused on star-studded musicals, right? It produced Gone with the Wind, Wizard of Oz in 1939. Warner Brothers became best known for gangster films. 20th Century Fox, historical. This all happened in the 1930s. If you wanted to work in Hollywood in the 30s, you belonged to a studio, okay? That was also a huge aspect of Hollywood. Now, what's interesting is here, I think this is where Hollywood becomes full circle, right? Because remember, the reason Hollywood became Hollywood is because Thomas Edison's group had a monopoly on the East Coast and wanted to control everything from essentially the idea to the distribution of film. Well, everyone broke away to go to Hollywood to kind of shake that up. Well, we kind of come full circle because studios at this point controlled everything from distribution, scheduling, promoting. Studios even had their own chain of theaters. The idea, it was to control the idea to box office. So if you wanted to work in movies in the heyday of the 30s and 40s, you worked for a studio. Each major studio had its own writers, directors, actors, actresses under contract, as well as technicians, equipment in lots. The studio had not only control over the whole production process, but also distribution, scheduling, promoting. Studios forced theater owners to show bad films, even if they wanted to show good ones. The studios even owned their own chain of theaters, and that was absolutely everything that you could possibly imagine in the 1930s and into the 40s. Well, it changes because basically the Justice Department in 1938 filed suit against Paramount and other major film companies for the practice of what they called vertical integration and vertical control. So essentially, it takes about 10 years, but post-World War II in 1948, it was a big federal ruling that essentially told these studios, hey, you've got to give up the distribution end of your, the exhibition end of your product. So theaters literally had to divest themselves from the film industry, and the film industry could not sit there and absolutely dictate what got played in theaters. And so that's what happens today. So a lot of your big theater chains, right? They're not owned by studios. They're a separate entity. And that is because of what's called vertical integration and vertical control. The other thing that happened during this era, by the way, there was a second major shift. Television comes along, and it began building a sizable audience. And by the late 1940s, it was certainly cutting into motion picture industry's profits. Okay. So, and another thing that happened during this time, and it seems totally counterintuitive now, but the film industry refused to advertise films on its new media, right? Basically, the film industry had nothing, it didn't want to have anything to do with television. And so, you know, of course, today we see all sorts of old films. We see current films. We see films that are advertised with trailers all over TV shows and whatnot. Imagine that wasn't the case in the 1940s and into the 1950s. Many studios didn't allow their stars to appear on television. You couldn't contractually be a film star and be a television person at the same time. That eventually changes. Hollywood also used gimmicks in the 1950s to build market share. So they started getting into smell-o-vision and 3D, and they started getting into, we'll talk a little bit more about it in the 1950s, but they started changing how films were made to try to basically differentiate Hollywood from the small screen of television, which they saw, Hollywood kind of saw television as sort of this like low end type of medium, like on the skyscraper, on the lower floors of the skyscraper, right? Plus, there were some other issues going on, and I'm sorry about the slides here. They're all kind of out of order here, but I want to talk about, so here's your gimmick stuff, right? Here's your 3D, your smell-o-vision, your Romarama, the Cinerama, which is that big dome that you would watch a film from a 360. Okay, they got into epic dramas and message movies, right? So let me back up though. Let me talk about the Hollywood blacklist before I get in those epic dramas. So the Hollywood blacklist, so there was a committee called HUAC, the House Committee on Un-American Activities. And this committee, led by a Republican senator in Illinois, Joseph McCarthy, essentially went after folks in Hollywood who this committee believed were starting to push the notion of communist storylines within film, right? So you have to understand, 1945, World War II ends. We are in the beginning of the Cold War with the Soviet Union at this time. And capitalism and communism were two polar opposite ways of thinking. And there's always been this belief that Hollywood has pushed sort of this, what a lot of people say is radical agenda on the American public. A modern day version of that might be what's happening with the culture wars between the LGBTQ plus IA, is that right? I hope I've got that all right, community, and what's happening with folks who are opposing that, right? So I don't know if you've seen the whole thing with Disney and Florida. Florida just passed a new law that basically says that teachers in Florida aren't to teach sexual orientation to kindergartners through third graders. That the curriculum needs to be age appropriate. The opposition to that is calling it a "Don't Say Gay" bill, right? Well, there's a big fight right now with Disney in Florida and the governor in Florida because there are a lot of people who think that Disney is now pushing some of the folks who are in that company, they're pushing their moral values on the public at large. Now, I'm not drawing an opinion one way or other. I don't want to come from that angle here. But what I'm trying to compare that to is similar kind of push back in the mid to late 40s and early 50s with the fact that there was this movement to essentially go after what some people were deeming in Hollywood as being people that were essentially trying to set the table for communism by producing content that would essentially make its way into film. So I know I'm doing a clunky way of explaining it, but let me just say that the committee held 9 days of hearings into alleged communist propaganda and influence in the Hollywood motion picture industry. After conviction on contempt of Congress charges for refusal to answer some questions posed by committee members, the Hollywood 10 were blacklisted by the industry. Eventually, more than 300 artists, including directors, radio commentators, actors, and particularly screenwriters, were boycotted by the studios. Some, like Charlie Chaplin, left the U.S. to find work. Others wrote under pseudonyms or names of colleagues. Only about 10% succeeded in rebuilding careers within the entertainment industry. That was a big problem for the bottom line in Hollywood, is that Hollywood, by many, was being perceived as communist sympathetic, and you had people that wanted to root that out so that because it was bad for business. So I implore you to read more up on HUAC, the House Committee on Un-American Activities. Look at a variety of different sources because everyone has a different opinion as to, the committee to Joseph McCarthy. There are some that absolutely think that it was terrific that he, kind of held Hollywood accountable. Others, of course, likened this to cancel culture back in the late 40s. and then he was out of line, and the whole movement was crazy. So I again, in the interest of balance, I want you guys to draw your own conclusions on that. But bottom line is, during the 1950s, that was going on. By the mid to latter part of the 50s, Hollywood was trying the idea of epic dramas and message movies. You know, James Dean was a big name during this time before he passed away. Charlton Heston, 10 Commandments, right? Ben-Hur, all of these movies were being made over the top, expensive, huge sets, location shooting, longer, 3 hours in the theater, and it didn't matter. Hollywood was losing its grip on the amount of people going to film because they had television as an option now. And by 1960, weekly attendance fell a staggering 75%. And by the end of the decade, studios provided TV with old films. They basically said, well, if we can't beat them, we got to join them. So that's what happened in the 1950s. By the 1960s, studios are losing more power, okay? Essentially they started, because they were losing so much money, they were seeing their power wane. The rise of the independent producer also hurt movie studios, because you had a lot of studios that were cutting back financially. They were obviously cutting loose directors, and they were cutting loose actors out of contracts, and producers and creators, and cinematographers, and all sorts of people that were behind the scenes. And these folks started coalescing in independent productions. And so by the end of the 1960s, roughly 80% of all American films were independent productions, okay? Films range from from vanilla, right? Because that's how the decade kind of starts. By the time the 60s ends, because we have, again, 2 major assassinations, we have our involvement in Vietnam, we have the drug culture developing in San Francisco. All of this led its way onto the screen. A lot of different genres popping up, or a lot of different edgy movies that were being made, or being made to kind of sort of like be a political statement toward what was happening at the time. And one of those, probably one of the more significant films of all time, at least I think, for the 1960s, was a movie called The Wild Bunch. It was made by Sam Peckinpah. And I meant to call it up over here. Let me do that real quick. And let me just kind of give you the quick synopsis of what this film was about. So the film basically is an aging group of outlaws look for one last big score as the traditional American West is disappearing around them. Now, what made this film significant, by the way, and again, I want you to click on that link and watch it yourself, because I think this will get taken down by YouTube if I actually click on it. But what it is Sam Peckinpah was a director in the late 60s who had been, like everybody during this time, had been watching all sorts of nonstop Vietnam coverage coming in to television on a nightly basis. This was the era of broadcast journalism, which we'll get into when we get to journalism. But anyway, he saw this violence happening on, real life violence, by the way, happening on newsreels that were being shown on broadcast on news programs, and thought that the American public was embracing it too much. They were embracing the idea of violence on film. They were embracing the idea of violence on the small screen, right, which is television. And he wanted to make a movie where there were scenes that were different, right? That where there was shades of gray, ethically and morally. And there's a infamous final scene, or one of the final scenes in The Wild Bunch, where it is just 4 minutes of extreme violence. I want you to watch it on your own time. And what's interesting about it is that it really, what Peckinpah was trying to do with that scene was essentially cleanse the American public out of its desire. Basically, show so much violence on screen and make it so gratuitous that we would get disgusted by it and not want any more of it. And the problem is it just went the opposite direction. It just made people want more of it. And so when you see films, I mean, even films in the 70s, films today, when there's just over the top violence. Think of Game of Thrones, by the way. There's, I mean, there's numerous examples of it in Game of Thrones. A lot of it is because we seem to sort of run towards the light, not away from the light, right? For a bug, we kind of zap ourselves. So in this case, the light is extreme violence on screen, and we seem to find ourselves wanting to watch it almost in a voyeuristically type way. Well, Peckinpah, never could rid the American public or the world of that sort of innate desire. But that's what the Wild Bunch was all about. It was about trying to cleanse the American public of wanting violence, and of course, it did just the opposite. Okay. As we get into the 1970s, studios merged or were bought out by bigger companies, right? So we start to see consolidation happening in a massive way. MGM and 20th Century Fox were sold to make room for real estate developers or actual like physical locations. The Supreme Court loosened controls on content, and as fallout, the Motion Picture Association of America, MPAA, liberalized its attitude towards self-regulation. The new system set up a G, PG, R, and X rating, and of course now that is what G, PG-13, R, and NC-17, I think, is the latest one. So anyway, that was you can point to the early 70s for that system coming into place. HBO was created in 1972. First run movies now screening on cable. Think about it, 13 years prior to that, Hollywood didn't even want to run a movie, an old movie or a current movie on TV at all. Now you have HBO, which is running, first run movies. So you can see it really becomes a thing, right? Revenue is up. Bigger budgets for films. Another link here, and if it doesn't work, I will make sure I give you an updated link. But does anyone know off the top of their head, silently think to yourself on this one because we're not in class, right? What the first blockbuster actually was considered? 1975. And I'll give you like 3 seconds to think about it. Well, in 1975, the first blockbuster, believe it or not, is Jaws. Yes, the movie about the shark, right? That came up. That was released in the midsummer of July of 1975. It was based on a Peter Benchley novel. Steven Spielberg, and Roy Scheider. Steven Spielberg directed it. Roy Scheider was the main actor. Robert Shaw was another big name in that film. Anyway. You know what the plot is. Basically, it's a great white shark that terrorizes Nantucket Island, unsuspecting beachgoers off of Nantucket Island during the middle of like a summer rush. And of course, anybody that's ever seen Shark Week on Discovery Channel or ever been to the beach thinks about sharks attacking them. That's what like played off those fears. So anyway, but what that did for Hollywood is it began an era where Hollywood would load up its biggest films at certain times of the year to maximize profits. So obviously the blockbuster season is no longer in July. It's much earlier. It usually starts in May or even as early as now in mid-April, or if you're watching this in the fall, it would be Christmas. But in any event, so blockbuster season, which is generally in the spring, a little bit of summer, and of course wintertime around the holidays. It's there because kids are out of school. College students are not as busy as they normally are during the heart of the season, and it just basically has led to this philosophy that kind of the more artsy films and the films that maybe won't do as well at the box office are released outside of these blockbuster times, right? The multiplex theaters, right, that we mentioned in a previous chapter, right, or previous YouTube video, multiplex theaters were also became very popular during this time. And then probably the biggest invention in the 1970s is the idea of the VCR, video cassette recorder. Sony Betamax is invented in 1975. RCA invents the half-inch in 1977. And the interesting thing is that just like television was seen as an evil doer to the film industry, as was VCRs. And so early on, Hollywood was first suspicious of the VCR. In fact, filed a lawsuit to try to keep people from watching movies on either on video or actually physically taping video or taping movies off of their TV. But the federal government said, sorry, can't do that. And so eventually Hollywood realized it could release these films straight to video and had a completely new revenue stream. And so went from basically treating it like a pariah to absolutely recognizing how much money it could make off of VCR sales and then later DVD rentals. And of course, now we pushed into the era of streaming content with Netflix, et cetera, right? The motion picture today is dominated by 6 big companies, which control 80% of the market, okay? Those include Sony MGM, NBC Universal, Disney, Fox, Warner Brothers, Paramount, okay? They're all very much a part of the equation. Of course, today we have huge salaries and back-end deals for Hollywood stars. So if you happen to be like one of those A-listers, you're not just making money for making the film, but you're also getting money on how much money the film makes at the box office. You're getting money from the merchandise it sells around it. And it's really pretty extraordinary as to, if you're an A-lister, how much money you're going to make. But you know, if you're an actor and you're taking this class, you know how small a chance it is that you're going to be making a lot of money as an actor in this industry. It's a very, very long shot indeed. All right, last but not least, some trends that have emerged or are emerging. I would say most of these have emerged at this point. The fact is we've gone from analog to digital. We've had that transition, which is basically where we've gone from film, you know, where if you ever went to a movie theater and walked up into the projection booth, it was all on film, 35 millimeter probably. That's where I remember it being. And of course, now it's all digital distribution, which has made, you know, being able to digitally distribute film has made it has made it much more cost effective. Producing and shipping film at one point cost more than $2,000. Think about that, going over to all sorts of different theaters across the country and the world. Well, of course, movies can be copied to hard drives, transmitted electronically by fiber, internet, or satellite at a much cheaper price. Of course, that does open up to hacking, but that's a whole nother story, right? But in any event, digital distribution was estimated to have saved Hollywood $1 billion with a B, $1 billion annually. And so there's always this like fight though that goes on between, you know, film versus folks that used to shoot on film versus folks that shoot on digital. You know, Spielberg is a big film guy. Quentin Tarantino, big film guy. I believe Steven Soderbergh also was a big film guy. And most of them have gone digital. Of course, one of the first, obviously, was George Lucas. So anyway, new movies are being downloaded to home computers, right? We're seeing them on Netflix. There's a whole issue of the rise and fall of Blockbuster Video. You know, Blockbuster used to be the biggest company on earth, video rental company on earth, and now is down to literally one store in Bend, Oregon, and it's more of a museum than it is an actual, like, I mean, it's still a running store, but people treat it more like a museum. But there was a story, by the way, back in like 2005 where Netflix was floundering. And remember, Netflix started out as a video rental service, not a streaming service that it is now. And Netflix actually wanted to get bought out by Blockbuster, and Blockbuster, the executives at Blockbuster at the time, I believe it was Viacom, turned it down because they didn't think it really had much of a future. Oh my goodness, what an amazing mistake that was, because, you know, we had an economic downturn in 2008. The money dropped out of the economy. Netflix evolves into a streaming service because the internet gets faster around that same time, and Blockbuster essentially, you know, craters. So imagine that. So movie watching, of course, is now mobile. First screen, by the way, would be film. Fourth screen would be your phone. Okay, so we're watching a lot of film now on our little fourth screen, where it started on you know, the film on the actual, like, you know, not film, sorry, the screen itself, you know, in a movie theater. It has completely evolved to watching it now on our phones. And last but not least, independent filmmakers now are circumventing the traditional studio system, the traditional model of having to, find a studio to fund a project. They're using, GoFundMe. They're using all sorts of, ways of raising money on the web to produce and screen content and make content. I invite you to click on that link. I think you'd enjoy that. But that is the film chapter. So much to it, so much rich history, so much how much it's culturally influenced us, so much how we still spend so much time watching film. And yeah, it's a very exciting chapter. And I'm sorry that we have to cut it short because we have other stuff to talk about in ensuing modules. But again, I remind you to look at all 3 YouTube videos that are connected, or I should say 3 YouTube lecture videos that are connected to this chapter. There's obviously going to be a lot of different links that you can click on independent of this that are in the PowerPoint. But the next time I see you will be when we talk journalism. That's the next chapter coming up. So it's been a pleasure talking film with you these past 3 parts. And that is it for today. So we'll see you soon.